Today's lecture deals with American government, and this is chapter 2 from the book, but I have to tell you it's not specifically from the book, but you will find the information in that chapter, so you do need to read that chapter. Now, when it comes to this term called federalism, I'm sure most of you have never even heard of that term. And so we're going to be talking about how government is structured, how it's set up, why it was set up that way, about the different levels of government. And so when we have many different levels of government, laws can be passed at many different levels. We have local type laws, and those are called ordinances. We have state level laws, and those are called statutes. And then we have national level laws, and those are called laws. Now I'm going to be telling you a little bit about how federalism affects the states when the federal government passes laws that are going to affect the states. Let me give you some examples right now, and we will be talking about these as we go through this lecture. The first one I want to talk about is a particular law that was passed called No Child Left Behind. And so this was started here in Texas when Governor Bush, George W. Bush, was governor of Texas. And so he went ahead and he set up this particular law in Texas so that K through 12 public school students could do better. Other states kind of adopted it, but it wasn't until he became president that he got this law passed and made it a national law where all of the states had to go ahead and abide by the standards or provisions of this particular bill. Now, it didn't exactly work out very well because there were many problems with this particular bill. And when President Obama took over, when he was elected as president, he changed it a little bit. But there's still many elements from this No Child Left Behind Act. And basically it was saying you need to follow these standards if you want federal money. Now, when it comes to the health care reform, you will probably know that as the Obamacare, and it's actually called Affordable Health Care Act. And so what happened with this one is that they're saying the law was passed, and all of the states had to be able to offer some level of health care to all of its citizens. Now, the way the law was set up, there are, again, many provisions. Some of them are good, some of them not so good. It just kind of depends on how you feel about it. That helps some people, they hurt some people. There have been several lawsuits about it, and it's actually gone to the Supreme Court. And there's one particular provision in this particular health care reform bill that says, you know what, you cannot penalize people for not having health care. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to decide whether or not it was constitutional to be able to do that. I'll be talking about that in just a little bit. And then we get to the legalized marijuana. Marijuana is legalized in certain states like Colorado, and I think it's Washington, a few other states. And so the national level laws say, no, drugs are not legal. Marijuana is not legal in the United States. So we'll see how that one is going to be playing out. Back in the olden days, when the government was going to be set up, or when we became our own nation, our founding fathers had a few options to say, okay, well, how are we going to set this system up? The first one they set up is the one at the very bottom, the Confederate system. And so basically the Confederate system was a very weak level of national level government, the federal level government, and the states are the ones that had most of the power. And because the states had most of the power, the federal government wasn't able to do a whole lot. And they said, no, if we want to be a United States, we need to have more power at the federal level, at the national level. So then there were a couple of ways they could do that. One way was to set it up as a unitary system. That's the second one. And so there are many countries that do have a unitary system of government. And so this one is basically saying, okay, we have one top guy that makes all the decisions, and then everybody else has to go ahead and follow those decisions that are made. So that's called very centralized power at the national level. And so we decided, well, no, that's not what we want, because remember, we were trying to get away from such control, such government control as they had in England, and England does have a unitary system of government, as does Canada. So we wanted to have it a different way. We wanted to shape our governance system in a different way. And so we said, we think we want to have the federal system of government. And so this federal system of government is basically a division between the national and the regional governments. It's a division of powers between the national and regional governments. And so basically it's set up, the Constitution set it up that way. And so what happened is the founding fathers said, we do not want this strong central government, because as we had under England, because we feel that it threatens the liberties that we have here, or that we want to have here in the United States. We don't want to be under somebody's thumb all the time. So what they did is that they set it up so that there are powers between the national and the state levels of government. It doesn't say anything about the local level, and we'll be talking way more about the local level of government when we get to that particular lecture. But the way they set it up initially is between the national and the state level government. Not only that, they also said, we also want to go ahead and have what we call the separation of powers, and y'all would know these as the branches of government. And the branches of government are basically the executive office, or the presidency, the legislative branch, or Congress, and the judiciary, which are the courts. And these will have separate powers, but they will have other powers that they share as well. And so this is the way that our American system was set up to be able to be the United States that we are today. So the interpretation of this particular concept has shifted over time, because it just depends on what's going on in the nation, or depends on what's going on in society, in the economy, etc., etc. And so the question is, should the federal government play a role? And the federal government doesn't always have to play a role, but sometimes they do. So if they do play a role, what this means is that there's going to be laws passed for it, for a particular thing, direct implication for making public policy. So let me give you an example of this one. You probably heard that we were in a Great Recession, and started in 2007, 2008. And so at that time, the economy started doing badly. We were heading into a depression, and so the federal government, and this was under George W. Bush, said, some of these banks are too big to fail. The auto industry was also impacted. The airline industry was all impacted. And so they passed this bailout money, and I'm sure you've heard of this bailout money, but it was actually the federal government that bought stock in a lot of these companies in order to bolster them up so that they would not fail, so that they could make it through the economy. So a law had to be passed for this. A law had to be passed for this. Okay, so the definition of federalism is this. It's the constitutional structure of shared and divided powers between the national and state governments. The constitutional structure of shared and divided powers between the national and the state governments. So you see, it doesn't say anything about the local government in there. The local governments exist because the states allow them to exist. Okay, so the constitutional basis is basically says this. This is what it says. It says all powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved for the states. It's a one-liner. All powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved for the states. So the states can have some laws, statutes that affect only that state and not at the federal level. Once it gets to the federal level, the national level, well, then all of the states have to do it. But it doesn't always have to be that way. Now you should be asking yourself, how is it that the federal government gets to call the shots? So I'm going to be talking about these things called constitutional pillars, and there's 4 constitutional pillars, and I'm going to be telling you about how Obamacare came about using these constitutional pillars. But the first one I want to talk about is this one called the National Supremacy Article, the National Supremacy Act. And so basically it says this. It says if there's a law at the state level or the local level, and then there's a federal law, well, then it's going to be the federal law that takes precedent over any kind of state or local laws, because the federal level laws are the ones that reign supreme. Okay, so how does this play out with the marijuana one? Okay, well, this is the way it is. They can sell marijuana in Colorado, but you can't smoke it on the street. You cannot transport it. You cannot resell it. So there are many different provisions or restrictions on what you can do. I told you in the last lecture that Texas, when it came to same-sex marriage, that Texas had the amendment saying that marriage is between a man and a woman. There was a Supreme Court ruling that came out, and that Supreme Court ruling makes same-sex marriages legal. And so all of the states had to abide by that. And again, this is because of this national supremacy article. The second constitutional pillar is called the war powers, and the war powers are basically used to protect the nation. If there's going to be a war, it is Congress who has the responsibility to declare a war, and it is the president's responsibility to deploy the troops. That's kind of the way that it works out. But within these war powers, there is a provision in there that says, you know, the military has the responsibility to use their scientific and technological knowledge to be able to do research and development for different types of things that they're going to need if we have to go to wars, different types of ammunition, if you want to call it that, different types of aircraft, different types of stealth bombers, but that they have the responsibility to go ahead and use tax money in order to do the research and development to advance that cause. You know, y'all may not know this or not, but do you know that everybody has a smartphone now, right? Think about the little microchip that's in there that gives you the ability to use it like a computer. Well, back in the olden days, they used these war powers, the scientific and technological knowledge part of it, because it was the military that actually invented the computers. But at that time, those CPU units took rooms and rooms and rooms. And so that was the invention. And so since that time, there have been many innovations where they made the chips smaller and smaller and smaller, where now you have access on your tablets or your iPhones or whatever. So that was commercialized. That part of it was commercialized. The third constitutional pillar is the power to regulate commerce. And so this one is called the Commerce Clause, and it says basically that business activity across state lines can be regulated if it's going to affect more than one state or even other nations. Okay, so Obamacare, back to Obamacare. So what happened is that whenever they sued, Obama asked for the Supreme Court to look at this penalty. It was going to be $750 that you were going to be penalized every year if you did not have insurance. And they said, we think that's unconstitutional. And so Obama says, well, if we have to get car insurance to drive, you know, it's using the same constitutional pillar, the Commerce Clause. I want it heard under that one. And the Supreme Court said, no, we are not going to hear it under that one. So in that way, it was a loss for Obama. But they said, we will hear it under this other constitutional pillar called the power to tax and spend. And so what this one does, it promotes laws for the general welfare. And so this is what they said. We see that Obamacare is a lot like Medicare. And Medicare has a tax. And if you've ever looked at your paycheck, you know, you pay your withholding, you pay Medicare, you pay you pay for Social Security, Medicare tax, withholding. So that Medicare tax goes into the national coffers. Okay, so this is what they said. It really belongs here because it's more like that Medicare tax. And so at that time they said, and we're going to give the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, the ability to implement it and to go ahead and deduct this money from people's refunds if they don't have insurance. So when this year when you are or I should say in 2016, all of the insurance, all of the IRS forms are asking specifically, do you have it? And there is a particular form that needs to accompany your income tax return to prove that you do have insurance. Otherwise, you're going to levy this tax. There are certain, well, we here in the United States, we have a Bill of Rights, and they're called the constitutional amendments at the national level. And so there are certain ones that we as states cannot mess with. You know, you have to adhere to these particular amendments because they are going to apply to everybody within the United States. And the first one is the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, and this says we need to treat all citizens equally. Now, this one is the one that's directly related to the same-sex marriage ruling, the Equal Protection Clause. Then we have the Due Process Clause, and those are the 5th and the 14th Amendments. And they say, you know what, that states must follow certain rules and procedures, especially when it comes to collecting evidence in criminal cases. You have to be given due process. You have to, people have to let you know that you're being charged. People have to let you know what your rights are, that type of thing. So that's due process. And so it allowed national governments to expand these areas that were formerly reserved for the states. So it's basically these constitutional pillars, the Bill of Rights, all of these have contributed to the expansion of the federal government and their ability to have a say in what's going on in our lives. Okay, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history or the evolution of federalism. And as I said at the beginning of the lecture, it depends on what's going on in the country as to how federalism is going to be used for our population, for the citizenry here. So way back in the olden days, look at this, 19th to the early 20th century, we were trying to industrialize. The country was trying to industrialize at that point. And so what happened is that we had been a very much an agrarian society, an agricultural economy. And so at that time, there was a strict interpretation of federalism. You know, they said the national government has specific powers, and so these powers included like the military for defense. It included trade. It included monetary policy, that types of things. And so those were the only things that the federal government was involved with. Everything else the states were doing. The states were the ones that were providing the services to their citizens. And they call this, or the metaphor that they use for this one is called layer cake federalism, because there were like two levels of government and they're just like connected by that middle icing in the cake. So layer cake federalism. Okay, then in the 1930s comes the Great Depression. This was like a really bad time in our country. And so a lot of people lost their money. Society was not doing well. The economy was not doing well. And so they had to go ahead and kind of like kickstart the economy. And they had to do whatever needed to be done in order for our economy to be able, in our country, to be able to thrive again. And so it was during this time that the federal government started to provide money to the states. It was during this time that a lot of the social programs started, and they started in 1935 through the Social Security Act. And so all of a sudden it's the national and the state governments that are going to be providing services to the states, because it was just such a black time during our the history of our country that a lot of things needed to be done. The Great Depression really hit us hard. It hit a lot of people hard. And so different types of laws needed to be passed in order to stop this from ever happening again. The federal government started providing money for this to the states. And so all of a sudden, this is why they call it cooperative federalism, because it's both the national government and the state level governments were providing services, and they were doing it because the federal government was sending money to the states to be able to offer some of these services. Okay, then in the 1960s comes creative federalism, and this was under LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so what he did is that he said, he wants there to be a great society, and the whole, and it was called the War on Poverty, that he wanted to eradicate poverty. And so what he did is he set up a lot of different programs, the pilot programs, to try to get rid of poverty, to try to diminish it, to try to eradicate it. And the way that he did that is that he gave federal money to the states for these pilot programs. And so I'm not going to say that they were very successful. They did have different types of programs, especially for housing. They had programs for work, employment. They had a lot of different types of programs, and this kind of set up the way that our society is today. If you're saying we have too many social programs, well, it kind of started with this one. It really took off in the 1970s, but it really started under LBJ and his creative federalism, because he was giving money to the states for pilot programs. Then when Nixon was elected into office, he came in with his new federalism. And so in this new federalism, most people don't know Nixon except for the Watergate scandals and that he was almost impeached, etc., etc. But he actually did a lot of good. Anyway, so he said that he wanted to give more money to the states, and he said, and this is called a states' rights argument, and that's very conservative ideology, because he said, you know what, it's the states that know what's going on, and so why should the federal government dictate to the states what need to be done? I'm just going to give them money. So it gave them more discretion in the programs that they were going to be having there, and what they were going to be spending their money on. And it was a particular program called General Revenue Sharing, but that one kind of went away. So this general revenue sharing went away through Reagan's new federalism. So when Reagan was elected, and this is Ronald Reagan, he came in with the express purpose of making government smaller, and he said that he was going to do this through federalism. And so he had what I call the 3D program: devolution, defunding, and decentralization. So let me talk a little bit about each of these. In the 1970s, so many different laws were passed at the national level. And he said, and Reagan said, this is ridiculous. It just caused the government to expand. And he said, government has gotten too big. We need to downsize it. We need to downsize it. And so what he did is that evolving means going forward, devolving means going backwards. So he sent the programs back to the states. And he says, states, y'all are going to be responsible to in implementing these programs. And when you do that, you have to meet the standards that are at the national level, but you have more discretion on how you're going to do that. And he says, and not only that, I'm only going to give you money for a few years. I'm going to start cutting back on that, and that's called defunding. So he was cutting back on the money that was being sent from the federal government, and he says, states, y'all are the ones that are going to pick up the slack here. Y'all are the ones that are going to have to come up with more money. Okay, so then he said, if the states have the programs, if they're the ones that are going to be funding it, then they also should be able to have the power to make the decisions, and that's called the decentralization. So basically he was saying, yes, there are federal level standards, but the states are going to take a larger role in how it's going to be implemented, based on the federal level standards. So he returned the power and the responsibilities back to the states. That was his 3D program. And Reagan's new federalism, or that type of new federalism, continued under George H.W. Bush, or Bush 1, and George W. Bush. Okay, then when Clinton was elected office, he inherited this huge budget deficit. And so his push was to get rid of that budget deficit. And so what he says, well, I really feel your pain, states, but we really don't have a lot of money. So he continued to devolve a lot of these programs back to the states, because at that time he had a very Republican Congress, and so he felt that he really had no choice. But what he was able to do is that he went ahead and established these things called enterprise zones. And so what the premise was for the enterprise zones was that in blighted areas or really poor areas, neighborhoods that have been very neglected, that if somebody came in and set up businesses there, that he would go ahead and help him out and give him some money. And so this is what he said. If you set up your business there, I'll go ahead and fund you for like part of the business expenses, etc., etc. But it was more the labor part. And they were saying if you hire people that are living in those areas, those blighted areas, that the federal government would pay 2/3 of their salary for the first year, like for it was a 3-year program, and then it would go ahead until it was 1/3 until the business had to pick up the information. I mean the salaries on their own. Other things that he did with these enterprise zones, he said if you are a teacher, a K through 12 teacher, and you are teaching in one of these inner city schools, and you want to buy a piece of property, a house in one of those blighted areas, that he would give that person the money for the down payment and the closing costs. Same thing for the police officers. If this is your area that you patrol, and if you decide to live in this area, I will go ahead and make that available to you. The same deal as for the teachers. The other thing that Clinton did is that he set up this one program that is still in existence. It's called AmeriCorps. Now, everybody's heard of the Peace Corps, right? Well, AmeriCorps is kind of like the Peace Corps, but you do it on American soil. But this is the good part about it, guys, is that if you go ahead and join the AmeriCorps and you serve a certain length of time, that all of your student debt will be forgiven. I'll say that again. If you serve in the AmeriCorps, all of your student debt will be forgiven. So just food for thought. Okay, then Obama is elected, and so when he was elected, this was around the time that the Great Recession was hitting. And so under Bush, it was a huge economic stimulus, the bailout package that I talked to you a little while ago. And so he went ahead and started regulating different aspects of the economy, and the economy did not like this at all, especially the banking industries. But one of the reasons that the economy was having problems was because the banks were making deals without any kind. They were just shady deals. Let's put it that way. They were shady deals that had no backing, and then all of a sudden, they couldn't support the types of derivatives that they were peddling to the economy. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Another aspect of it was the housing market, that people were getting houses, they were buying houses that they really didn't qualify for, and a big chunk of it was because they were not really checking to find out if people were actually making as much money as they were stating. So he put in different types of regulators to check on the banking industry, on the housing industry, etc., etc., on mortgage brokers, or the ones that were actually giving you the mortgages, that they really didn't have any kind of standards that they had to adhere to. Well, now they do. The other thing that he did is that he went ahead and got the Affordable Health Care Act, this Obamacare that I was talking about. So he got that one passed, and it was not supported. I think maybe one Republican voted for it, but it was primarily the Democrats that voted for it. So I said there's some good parts to it, and there's some not so good parts to it. And so right now, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with this Affordable Care Act. Yes, it is true that more people have been able to get insurance. It is also true that a lot of the doctors are not accepting this type of they call it AHC, the Obamacare. A lot of doctors are not accepting these clients, or these patients, I should say. So it just kind of depends. We'll see what happens. It's still playing out. Okay, I talked a little bit about the separation of powers, and now I want to talk about the division of powers. And so I'm going to be talking about many different types of powers that we have. And again, these are in the book, so be sure to read that. The first one I want to talk about are delegated powers. And delegated powers are two types. They're explicit and then there's implied. So the explicit are the ones that are specifically stated in the Constitution. And those are those constitutional pillars that I was talking about. And so they're explicit, expressed, enumerated. So you can use several different words for these, or several different terms, but they're all explicit powers. And so there are exclusive powers. These are exclusive powers for the national level only, plus maybe some of the concurrent powers. Then we have implied powers. So these are not specifically stated in the Constitution, but it gives Congress, it gives the president the ability, that gives the courts the ability to do what needs to be done for the country when it needs something. So they are it gives them the authority in using the necessary and proper clause based on the interpretation of the Constitution and the Supreme Court rulings. So they're implied to do whatever the country needs done. Now, these concurrent powers are the powers that are shared with the states. And so some of these powers that are shared with the states are the ability to tax. Some states have income taxes, state income taxes. We in Texas don't. To borrow money to regulate interstate commerce. Now, if they're going to be only for the states, those are called reserve powers. And these powers belong only to the states and not shared with the federal government at all. So they're reserved for the states. Okay, so you have delegated powers. Delegated powers can be explicit or they can be implied. They're mostly for the federal level government, and then it can also be some with the states. If they're shared with the states, those are called concurrent powers. If they're only for the states, those are called reserved powers. One of the questions that you should be asking yourself is, well, then how does the government get these states to do what they want them to do? To adhere to all of these different standards, federal standards? Well, they do it through the use of money, believe it or not. And so I'm going to be talking about a few kinds of types of money, or the way the money comes to the states and what you can use it for. And sometimes the government has more strings attached to it, and sometimes not so many strings attached to it. Okay, it's called fiscal federalism. It's used to influence state and local policies. Okay, the first one I want to talk about are block grants. And these are called community development block grants, or just block grants. And so what happens is that it's money coming down the states, coming from the federal government to the states and to the local governments, and they have fewer restrictions. And so this type of money has a match, or all federal money has a match. We don't have 100% pure federal money. They all have a match. And so the type of matches that they have would be, for example, 90%, like the welfare, the welfare that we have, it's a block grant. That's how much money comes from the federal government, and the state has to put in the 10%. Or it could be something like, I don't know if you're familiar with this program, but it's called the CHIPS program, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Okay, it's federal money, and so it'll come to the state for health insurance for kids, and these are basically the working poor. It's not like the real poor, that's Medicaid. This is the working poor. And so what happens is that the federal government will give X amount of money, and the state has to match like at 25%. That one is a 25% match, and that's what they call it, a match. And so each state can go ahead and decide what their income cap is going to be, and how many children they want served. And so Texas, I don't know if you know this or not, but we're like way at the bottom of the list when it comes to health care in Texas, and particularly children's health care in Texas. And so when Rick Perry was governor, the federal government said, well, Texas, I mean, I see that you have a lot of uninsured kids, so we're going to give you this huge amount of CHIPS money for the children, of CHIPS money. And at that time, Rick Perry said, well, wait a minute. We don't want, if you give us this much money, that means that we have to come up with this much of a matching grant, and we don't want to spend that much. We don't want to spend that much on children's health care. We want to have like a smaller amount, so we're going to be accepting less money from the federal government, because we just don't want to have, and this is again, it's very conservative ideology. We don't want to have a lot of like welfare types programs for the citizens of Texas. So they sent a lot of that money back. They sent it back to the federal government. And so the federal government said, well, Texas returned a big chunk of its money. Anybody want it? And the states were going, ooh, 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 I'll take it, I'll take it, I'll take it. Okay, another example would be the community policing, and you probably don't even have never heard of this one. But then that money dried up. There's no more money available for it. But there was money that said, we would like to have police in the neighborhood. So if you drive around and you see police cars at like the 7-Elevens or the Stripes or whatever they're called now, then you just see them hanging out. There's a reason that they're there, because the thinking is this, that it's their substation. It's like their workplace, because what they're saying is that when something happens in a neighborhood, and if there's a police presence there, that they will be able to respond quicker. And not only that, it would probably deter any type of action, if any type of crime, or it'll lessen crime if they think that there's a policeman that's patrolling that area on a continuous basis. And crime has decreased as well. And as I said, that money dried up, and so the city came back to us and they said, well, if you want to, like we the voters, and they said, if you want to go ahead and keep this program, we're going to need to go ahead and ask you to pay a little bit in the sales tax. I'll talk more about that when I talk about local government, but we approved it. We approved it and said, yes, we want to continue community policing. Okay, a second type of grant that I'm going to talk about are they're called the categorical grants. And these also require matching funds, but it's for a specific purpose, restrictive conditions, and this one means there are strings attached. It's got to be something, we'll give you the money, but it's got to be the way that we want it done. An example of this one would be the JFK Causeway. If you were not from this area, you probably don't know what the JFK Causeway is, but basically that's the bridge that goes over to the island. And so when they got the money, so this is the way it came down. It was the U.S. Department of Transportation that sent it to the TxDOT, or Department of Transportation for Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT. And so they said, we're going to send you this amount of money, and that was 75%. And Texas, you have to come up with the other 25%. So the state said, okay, well, we'll go ahead and kick in 15% of that. And but the city and the county, Corpus Christi, Nueces County, you all have to kick in the other 10%. And U.S. Department of Transportation said you can only use it for the JFK Causeway. Now, around that time, the Crosstown Expressway, the one that goes into downtown, that one was also being built. It was being expanded more to the south side. And they said you cannot use it for that one. And now the reason that they pinpointed the JFK Causeway is that they said, you know what, that this is the only way that people that are living on the island, it's their only exit route in the event of a hurricane. And it used to be the bridge that was there. There were sections of it that would flood, and people couldn't get off the island. If you didn't leave when they told you to leave, you were kind of stuck there. And because we have a lot of tourists that are going over to the island, it's their only way out as well. So they kind of earmarked that money. They said specifically it's only for this particular causeway. And then when it comes to the states and the federal systems, there are a few that are pertinent to this particular part of it. And the first one that I want to talk about is full faith and credit. And so any kind of public acts, any type of judicial proceedings from other states are going to be recognized in all of the other states. And as I said, the gay marriage, that one was one that was the exception to the rule. But since the court ruling came down, the Supreme Court ruling came down saying that same-sex marriage is legal in all of the states, then all of the states, including Texas, has to go ahead and abide by that Supreme Court ruling. Now, the next one that I would talk about is the one called rendition, and you probably have never heard of this particular term, but it just means that if a person commits a crime here in Texas, say in Nueces County, and he flees, he goes up to Oklahoma, but the person has to be tried here because Nueces County has jurisdiction because the crime was committed here. Well, then the state, and especially the governor, or specifically the governor, I should say, has the right to ask for that particular prisoner or the perpetrator to be extradited back to this particular area. So you've heard the term extradition, I'm sure, but it's also called rendition. So bring him back so he can stand trial here. So extradition of criminals from other states back to Texas. Okay, and that concludes this particular lecture. You do have a video that you will need to be watching and a discussion forum as well, so please check the syllabus.